A 14-year-old boy was convicted and executed for a crime he didn't commit. This is the heartbreaking story of George Stinney Jr., one of the most tragic miscarriages of justice in American history. But this case wasn't as simple as it seemed. A series of chilling twists would reveal a system failing an innocent child, leading to a devastating end that still haunts America today. Imagine being a child, 14 years old, and finding yourself trapped in a nightmare so incomprehensible that it twists everything you thought you knew about justice. George Stinney Jr. was accused of something he never did. His fate sealed by a rushed trial, a coerced confession, and a community that feared him simply because of the color of his skin. What happened to George wasn't an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the deep racial divides that scarred this country and still linger in many ways today. But the story doesn't end with George's death. This case would fester in the history for decades, only to be reopened years later, when it was far too late to save him. By the time anyone truly questioned what had happened, George had already been laid to rest in the most unjust way possible. His name erased too quickly. You see, this story isn't just about a boy who was wronged. It's about the system that allowed it to happen, and the questions it still raises. How many others have suffered the same fate? And how far can a community's fear and prejudice go before it consumes the truth? Let's take a step back. It's 1944 in Alcolu, South Carolina, a quiet rural town. The country is entrenched in a war abroad, but here, in this small town, there is a different kind of battle taking place, one that has been fought for generations. The town is divided, and at the heart of it is race. On the morning of March 24th, 1944, two young girls, Betty June Binnicker, just 11 years old, and Mary Emma Thames, only 7, left their homes to ride their bicycles around the outskirts of town. They were familiar sights in the community, innocent, full of life, with bright smiles that would make anyone who saw them pause for a moment. They never returned. Their bodies were found later that day, discarded near a railroad track. The small, secluded spot where they were discovered became the center of an investigation that would leave scars on Alcolu for decades. Both girls had been brutally murdered, beaten beyond recognition, and then left as though they were nothing more than trash. The horror of their deaths sent shockwaves through the town. For anyone who knew Betty and Mary, the loss was unimaginable. And as the community searched for answers, the truth would take a horrifying, twisted turn. Enter George Stinney Jr. He was 14, the youngest of 11 children, and his family lived in a shack on the outskirts of Alcolu. He was known in town, but not particularly well-liked. George was a quiet boy, soft-spoken, reserved, yet often seen working with his father on their small farm. He didn't have any history of trouble with the law, and there was nothing that seemed to suggest he would suddenly be involved in such an unimaginable act. But George Stinney was black, and in the 1940s South, in a town like Alcolu, that was reason enough for suspicion. When George was seen near the area where the girls had last been seen, he became the primary focus of the investigation. A single witness claimed to have seen him with the girls, and just like that, he was arrested. What happened next is where the story takes its most chilling turn. Despite his age, George was interrogated without any legal representation, without his parents being present, and without even being informed of his rights. After hours of questioning, hours in which he was alone and scared, a confession was obtained. A confession that was shaky, unclear, and likely coerced. A confession from a boy who, by all accounts, had no reason to lie, but also no way of understanding the gravity of what was happening to him. George was charged with the murder of two young girls. His trial, just 3 months later, would be held with a speed and indifference that would be unheard of in a modern court of law. The trial lasted only a few hours. He was found guilty by an all-white jury. And just a few months later, on June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was executed by electric chair. Think about that for a moment. A 14-year-old boy, so small they had to use a Bible to prop him up in the chair, sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit. And it didn't end there. George's name was quickly erased from history. The injustice of his death was buried under a veil of racial prejudice, and it wasn't until decades later that the truth began to resurface. But by then it was too late. The child they had taken so brutally had already been lost. This is not just a story about a crime or an innocent boy who was wrongfully convicted. It is a story that forces us to ask hard questions about the nature of justice. The brokenness of a system that failed not only George, but countless others who walked through the same doors of prejudice. The tragedy of George Stinney Jr. is a reminder that sometimes the deepest wounds are not those inflicted physically, but those created by the systems that are meant to protect us. We can look back and ask, how did this happen? And could it have been prevented? Alcolu, South Carolina. A small, sleepy town where the rhythm of life was slow and predictable, shaped by the land and the people who called it home. This wasn't a place where tragedies happen often. People knew each other's names, their families, their histories. It was a community where everyone had their place. But in the spring of 1944, something terrible would shatter that sense of security. It was March 24th, a mild afternoon, when the last thing anyone expected to see were two innocent young girls, Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, disappearing from their homes. They were out riding their bikes. Something so simple, so innocent. Just like any other day, their laughter carried on the wind, mixing with the buzz of cicadas in the trees. But that day, their laughter would be the last sound anyone would hear from them. And the following days would unravel a mystery that would stain Alcolu's name for generations. By the time the sun had set, the small town of Alcolu was already holding its breath. The two girls had not returned home. Their families searched the streets, calling out their names, hoping to hear them respond from behind the hedges or the next corner. But as the hours stretched into night, there was no sign of them. And then the unthinkable happened. The next day, the girls' bodies were discovered. It wasn't a secluded area, but a spot that made sense only in the twisted reality of what had occurred. They were found near some railroad tracks, partially hidden in a patch of woods, their small, lifeless bodies battered beyond recognition. The brutality of the crime left everyone speechless. These weren't just children. They were little girls so full of potential, their entire future stolen from them in an instant. Betty and Mary were beaten, their skulls fractured. The violence of it all was incomprehensible, something you'd never expect to happen in a town like Alcolu. The brutality made no sense. Whoever had done this must have been filled with unrestrained hatred, yet there seemed to be no clear motive. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was senseless. And that's where the mystery began. The discovery of the bodies sent a ripple through the town. People were shocked, terrified. How could this happen in their quiet, peaceful town? As the news spread, so did the questions. Who could have committed such a heinous act? Was it someone from the town? A stranger passing through? Local authorities were called in immediately, and soon, the town was teeming with officers, investigators, and townsfolk eager to learn what had happened. Yet, with all the attention and resources being poured into the search, the answers were frustratingly elusive. There were no immediate suspects, no clues that stood out, just the brutal, inexplicable deaths of two young girls. But then came a break in the case, or at least what seemed like a break. The first hint of suspicion fell on someone who had been seen near the railroad tracks. The 14-year-old African-American boy, George Stinney Jr. The sighting wasn't anything substantial. He had been seen walking down the same dirt road not long before the girls had gone missing. But in a town like Alcolu, where racial tensions were already at their peak, that was enough to fuel suspicion. The police quickly shifted their focus, and George became the prime suspect. George was arrested just hours after the bodies were found. The investigators had little to go on, but George's name had surfaced, and that was enough. They took him into custody, even though there were no solid reasons for his involvement. The town's racial divides played a heavy role in the investigation. George was African American, and in 1944, being black in the South meant that suspicion fell on you immediately. That was the way the system worked. There was no room for doubt, no chance for fairness. It didn't matter if there was no physical evidence linking George to the crime. He had been seen in the area, and that was enough to turn him into a suspect in the eyes of the police. What followed next was a series of mistakes, errors, and gross oversights in the investigation. The police didn't question other people of interest, and they didn't look for other leads. The focus was entirely on George, an easy target in a town filled with racial prejudice. He was interrogated alone, with no legal representation, no parent present, and no adult to help him navigate the situation. And then, after hours of questioning, a confession came. A confession that seemed more like the result of intimidation and fear than any kind of truth. George's words were muddled, inconsistent, and hardly made sense. But the authorities, eager to close the case, seized on it. They had their suspect. They didn't need anything else. The rush to solve the case, at any cost, had set the stage for what would come next. The police had found their scapegoat, a 14-year-old boy who had no idea of the gravity of what was happening to him. George Stinney Jr. had become the town's answer to an unanswerable tragedy. Was George really guilty? Or was he just another casualty of a system too broken to protect him? That question would go unanswered for decades. And for George, the worst was yet to come. After George Stinney Jr. was taken into custody, the small town of Alcolu seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. Finally, they had someone to blame. The police moved quickly, believing they had found their culprit. But in truth, what they had was nothing more than a scared 14-year-old boy with no defense. There was no physical evidence linking George to the crime. No fingerprints on the bodies, no traces of hair or fibers that could tie him to the murder scene. And yet, the authorities were convinced. There were conflicting witness statements, too. Some people said they'd seen George walking near the railroad tracks, but so had many others in town. There was nothing to suggest he had any more involvement than anyone else. One of the main theories early on suggested that George had been with the girls just before their deaths, but that theory never added up. George himself had no clear memory of any violent encounter, and yet the police were determined to pin the crime on him. They were under immense pressure to find the killer, and with George in custody, it was all too easy for them to close the case prematurely. Witnesses who could have provided crucial details were ignored, or their statements were twisted to fit the narrative that was developing around George. The search for the real killer seemed secondary to the rush to find anyone guilty of such a horrific crime. Then came the confession. A 14-year-old boy, already terrified and alone, was interrogated by police without his parents, without a lawyer, and without anyone to guide him. George was taken to the station, where he was questioned for hours. He had no idea what his rights were, and his youth made it even easier for the authorities to manipulate him. There was no written record of the confession. No formal statements. No evidence that George had actually confessed of his own volition. What the police had was a vague, rambling story that George gave them after being pressured, threatened, and coerced into saying what they wanted to hear. The police told George that if he confessed, the trial would be over and he would be sent to a reformatory. But if he didn't confess, they hinted things could get much worse for him. It was a promise of leniency that George, a frightened child, latched onto. He was told to sign papers he couldn't even read. He was intimidated and made to feel that the only way out was to agree with the accusations, even if they weren't true. What's chilling is that George's confession was made without any written record. In fact, the police never even took notes during the interrogation. There were no safeguards, no attempts to ensure that the confession was legitimate. The confession, which was eventually used to convict him, was nothing more than a product of desperation, fear, and coercion. George had been broken by the pressure, and in his mind, confessing seemed like the only way to end the nightmare. The investigation itself was a series of blunders, and at its core was the overwhelming influence of racial prejudice. This was 1944 in the Deep South, where racial lines were drawn clearly and deeply. George was an African-American boy, and in a town like Alcolu, where segregation was the norm, that fact alone made him an easy target. The rush to close the case on a black suspect, especially one who was so young, reflected the racial climate of the time. It was an open secret that many people simply did not care to find the truth when the wrong person was arrested. But the mistakes didn't stop there. The authorities didn't bother to investigate other leads. No one looked into possible white suspects or questioned others who might have been nearby. In fact, it was never even considered that the girls' deaths could have been the result of something other than a random act of violence carried out by George Stinney. There was no serious forensic investigation. There was no effort to examine the crime scene thoroughly. The bodies of Betty June and Mary Emma were found in an area that wasn't exactly remote. It could have been easily accessed by anyone, and yet the police never asked the right questions. They didn't even bother to conduct a thorough autopsy that might have revealed more about the time of death or the nature of the attack. This was not an investigation that sought justice. It was a hasty, one-sided search for a convenient answer, and the answer they found was George. The authorities didn't care about the details. They didn't care about fairness. What mattered was that they had found someone to blame. And for George Stinney Jr., it wouldn't matter that he was innocent. He would soon face the full weight of a broken justice system that had already made up its mind. There would be no fair trial, no proper defense, no second chances. And as the investigation drew to a close, one thing became clear. George Stinney Jr. was not the person who had killed Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames. But that truth, buried deep under the weight of lies and racial injustice, would not surface until decades later. The trial of George Stinney Jr. was a spectacle, one that should have never taken place. It was almost as if his fate had already been sealed before he even entered that courtroom. There was no time to properly prepare. There was no time to find a decent defense attorney. And that wasn't just an oversight. It was part of the plan. George was a poor, African-American child from a rural town. The system, in its racist efficiency, didn't even pretend to offer him a fair trial. George didn't have a lawyer who could fight for his innocence. Instead, he had a court-appointed attorney who seemed more interested in getting the trial over with than in defending his young client. No real investigation into George's innocence had been done. No evidence was presented to show he was not involved. Instead, the state relied solely on the coerced confession, the confession of a child who had been manipulated and intimidated into saying what the police wanted him to say. But perhaps the most chilling detail of this trial was the jury. An all-white jury, deciding the fate of a 14-year-old African-American boy. In a time when racial segregation was still brutally enforced, how could they have been impartial? How could they possibly see George as anything other than a scapegoat? It's hard not to imagine the biases that lingered behind their decision-making process. There was no doubt in their minds. George Stinney was guilty. Guilty because of his race, his age, and his place in a town that wanted to put the blame somewhere, anywhere. By the time the trial had even begun, the outcome had already been decided. George had no defense. His appointed attorney did nothing to counter the prosecution's case. There were no experts to question the validity of his coerced confession. No evidence to suggest he was actually guilty of the crime. No attempt to have his voice heard properly. And if that wasn't enough, the trial was over almost as soon as it began. It lasted barely 2 hours. Yes, you heard that right, 2 hours. The jury deliberated for just 10 minutes before they returned with a guilty verdict. 10 minutes. A decision to end the life of a 14-year-old boy was made in less time than it takes to finish a lunch break. It was as if George's life was already written in the pages of that courtroom. A life marked by racial bias, by an uncaring society that valued his skin color more than his humanity. The trial was a mockery of justice. The prosecutors spoke passionately about what a dangerous child George was, citing his confession as undeniable proof of guilt. But no one bothered to ask the question that should have been at the heart of the case. Was George truly guilty, or was he the victim of a system so broken that it was incapable of seeing him for what he truly was, a scared boy, pressured into a corner with no way out? In the eyes of the jury, none of that mattered. George Stinney was guilty because that was easier than confronting the uncomfortable truths of their society. It was easier than admitting that a 14-year-old child had been railroaded into a crime he didn't commit. The verdict came quickly, and in many ways, it was just a formality. A 14-year-old boy had been found guilty, and now it was time for the sentencing. George's fate was sealed. The courtroom was heavy with silence as the judge read the verdict aloud. Guilty of murder in the first degree. It was a statement that echoed with the weight of tragedy. It wasn't just the loss of 2 young lives, but the senseless destruction of George's life as well. The community was stunned, but not for the reasons they should have been. Some felt relief that the case had been solved, while others couldn't escape the sinking feeling that something was terribly wrong. The grief of the victims' families was understandable. Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames had lost their lives, and it was natural for their families to seek justice. But justice for the victims did not lie in condemning an innocent child. And yet, this was what happened. What was perhaps most heart-wrenching was the fact that George had no idea what was happening. He was 14 years old, a child who had been thrust into a nightmare far beyond his understanding. He was sentenced to die by electrocution in the electric chair. Yes, a 14-year-old, an innocent child condemned to death by a broken, racist system. No one seemed to ask whether George even fully understood the magnitude of what was happening. No one seemed to care. His youth, his innocence, and his fear were dismissed entirely. In the eyes of the law, George Stinney Jr. was nothing more than a symbol of a broken justice system, one that cared more about expediency than truth. The guilty verdict was read, and George Stinney, despite the overwhelming evidence that should have exonerated him, was sent to death row. The people of Alcolu had their closure. But at what cost? The tragic part of this case is that no one truly mourned for George, not in the way that mattered. The people who were supposed to fight for him had failed him at every turn. And George, a young boy with a whole life ahead of him, would soon face the ultimate price for a crime he did not commit. In the days leading up to George Stinney's execution, there was no last-minute reprieve, no time to right the wrongs that had been committed. He had been sentenced to death by electrocution, and the clock was ticking down on his life. What makes this even more devastating is the rush to execute him. In just a matter of months, a young boy's life was snuffed out. No chance for a fair appeal, no meaningful examination of the case, no attempt to examine new evidence or reconsider the trial. The urgency with which they wanted to carry out the execution was palpable, but it wasn't born out of a need for justice. It was about closing the book, putting this embarrassing chapter behind them. As George sat in his cell, he had no real chance to prepare himself for what was coming. There was no proper legal representation in his final days. No one to speak on his behalf, to fight for the truth that had been buried beneath the weight of prejudice and poor decisions. What's even more heartbreaking is that George's family, his parents, who were struggling with their own sense of powerlessness, could do nothing to save him. They had already seen their son dragged through the system, stripped of any sense of fairness, and now they had to face the unspeakable reality that they would lose him forever. Imagine what it must have been like for his mother and father, knowing that the state was about to end their son's life, and doing nothing to stop it. When the day finally arrived, there was no dignity in how it was carried out. George Stinney, 14 years old, was led to the electric chair. And let me pause here to emphasize something. This was a child, a boy who wasn't even old enough to fully grasp what was happening to him. But there he was, shackled, walked to a chair that was far too large for his small frame. The electric chair, a device built for adults, was the instrument of his death. Can you picture it? The chair, towering over him, as he sat there, trying to fit into it. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it was cruel. And the executioners didn't even stop there. They needed to prop him up with a Bible, placed beneath his neck, to make sure he was upright enough to receive the fatal jolt of electricity. A Bible, to hold his neck straight, as if this tragedy could be salvaged by a book of prayer. This moment is one of the most haunting images of this entire case. A Bible being used to prop up the neck of a child who should never have been in that chair. A child who should never have been condemned to die. It wasn't just the childlike innocence of George Stinney that made this so tragic. It was the cold, mechanical way that his life was taken from him. The system worked as it was designed to, but it was not a system that was interested in justice. At 7:30 p.m. on June 16, 1944, George Stinney Jr. was electrocuted to death. The state of South Carolina did what it had decided to do months earlier. They killed an innocent boy. The witnesses in the room reported that George's body twitched after the electricity hit him. But there was no fight left in him. There couldn't be. George Stinney was dead. And just like that, it seemed as though the case was closed. The execution was carried out swiftly, and the town of Alcolu, South Carolina, moved on. But that doesn't mean the community was in agreement. Some still believed George was guilty, clinging to the narrative that had been pushed so hard by the police and the prosecutors. They wanted to believe that the system worked, that the execution was justice served. But others, deep down, began to question. They began to ask themselves, was George really guilty? How could a 14-year-old boy have possibly committed such a brutal crime? And more importantly, how could a system that was supposed to protect the innocent have failed so spectacularly? Despite these questions, little was done to investigate further. The death of George Stinney Jr. was just another casualty of racial prejudice. His execution was rushed, and after it happened, no one in the town, no officials, no one in power, looked back to reconsider whether they had made a mistake. In fact, it wasn't until decades later that anyone would dare to ask those difficult questions. But the damage had been done. George was gone. His family was shattered. And the injustice of it all lingered in the air long after the electric chair had been turned off. As the years went on, people began to forget George's name, as they often do with tragic stories like his. But for those who still remembered, for those who still cared about the truth, George Stinney's story was far from over. The execution of George Stinney Jr. is a chilling reminder of a time when injustice was not just accepted, it was institutionalized. The images of that night, the small chair, the Bible used to prop up his fragile neck, the last moments of a child who had been denied his innocence. 70 years after George Stinney was executed, in 2014, his conviction was finally overturned. The decision came like a slow drip, years of silence finally breaking free. For 7 decades, a grave injustice had been allowed to sit, rotting in the pages of history, until modern investigation unearthed the truth. It wasn't until 2014 that new evidence came to light, evidence that should have been uncovered decades earlier, evidence that should have saved George's life. Investigators and legal experts began to re-examine the case, with the scrutiny that had been desperately lacking all those years ago. What they found was horrifying. There was no credible evidence linking George Stinney to the crime. In fact, it was clear that the police and prosecutors had failed to do even the most basic work to ensure justice was served. There were no physical signs of George's involvement in the crime, no forensic evidence, no confessions that held up under any scrutiny. And what's more, it was revealed that Stinney had been interrogated for hours without any legal representation, his confession likely coerced by fear and intimidation. It had taken 70 years for the truth to make its way into the light. Imagine the toll it must have taken on the people who fought for justice, knowing that they had been so late in bringing this truth to the surface. George's family, who had spent their lives mourning a loss that should never have happened. And yet, there was some sense of relief. Finally, the stain of George Stinney's wrongful conviction and execution could be cleared. But it came at a heavy cost, a cost measured in lost time and irreversible pain. The exoneration of George Stinney Jr. in 2014 did more than just right one wrong. It became a symbol of how easily a life can be destroyed by racial prejudice, by systemic failures, by hasty decisions made in a moment of fear and bias. The case quickly gained attention in the national conversation about racial injustice in the United States. People began to look at the history of this case through the lens of what was happening today. How many other children have suffered from the same broken system? How many wrongful convictions remain unresolved, and how many lives are still trapped in that system, lost to time, to fear, to prejudice? There was outrage, of course. Outrage that a 14-year-old boy had been condemned to death for a crime he didn't commit. But that outrage soon turned into something deeper, a call for accountability, a demand for change. The case of George Stinney became a rallying cry for those who believe that justice is far from perfect in this country, that the system is flawed, and that too many lives, like George's, have been destroyed by those flaws. And this conversation isn't over. We're still asking ourselves, how many George Stinneys are out there? How many innocent people are suffering because the system failed them, because their voices were ignored or never heard at all? George Stinney Jr.'s case is a heartbreaking reminder of just how fragile our justice system can be. A 14-year-old boy, innocent, full of potential, had his life stolen from him by a system that chose to look the other way. He was convicted and executed in the blink of an eye, without the fairness or dignity that every person deserves. For 70 years, the world forgot George. It wasn't until 2014 that his name was cleared. But by then it was too late. Too many years had passed, and George Stinney, who was never given a fair chance, had already paid the ultimate price. This story isn't just about one boy's tragic death. It's about the many others who have faced similar injustices. How many lives were lost in the shadows, forgotten by a system that was supposed to protect them? How many other children, like George, were wrongfully convicted and never given the chance to prove their innocence? Think about it. How many other children have been wrongfully convicted and executed? How many lives have been destroyed because of a system that failed them? And what does George Stinney's case tell us about the state of justice today? How can we truly know that justice is being served when we look back at the history of wrongful convictions and injustice? How many other cases are there out there that haven't been uncovered yet? How many people are still languishing in prison, fighting for the truth to be heard? I want you to think about the story we just shared, the life of George Stinney. And then I want you to ask yourself, how can we, as a society, ensure that no one else has to go through what he did? What do you think? Should justice have been served sooner for George Stinney? How many more cases like his are waiting to be exposed? Let me know in the comments below. And if the story moved you, I ask you to like and share this video so that we can continue to have these important conversations. And don't forget to subscribe so we can bring more stories like this to the surface. Justice may be delayed, but we can keep fighting for the truth, one story at a time.